What if I told you that a homeless girl shivering on a stranger's porch would destroy a $1 billion empire with nothing but the truth? That a single father's act of kindness would ignite a war between love and legacy that would shake an entire state? Tonight, I'm sharing the incredible true story of Luke Bennett and Clare Montgomery. Tale that proves sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption isn't money or influence, but the unbreakable bond between broken souls who refuse to stay broken. Stay with me until the end of this journey, and please comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The storm had been raging for 3 hours when Luke Bennett first heard the sound that would change everything, a soft, desperate sob cutting through the howl of wind and rain like a knife through silence. He paused at his kitchen window, coffee mug halfway to his lips, and peered into the darkness of his front yard. Lightning flickered, illuminating the skeletal branches of the old oak tree, but nothing more. For a moment, he wondered if he'd imagined it. Lord knew he'd been hearing things lately, phantom cries from Jacob's room, when his son was fast asleep, echoes of his ex-wife's laughter in empty hallways. Grief and exhaustion had a way of playing tricks on a man's mind. But then he heard it again. Clearer this time. Definitely real. Luke set down his mug and moved to the front door, his bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floor. Through the peephole he saw nothing but sheets of rain and the amber glow of the streetlight. But the crying continued, muffled and broken, coming from somewhere close. Too close. He unlocked the deadbolt and cracked the door open immediately, feeling the sting of wind-driven rain on his face. "Hello?" he called out, his voice nearly lost in the storm. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a sharp intake of breath and the sound of shuffling movement. Luke stepped onto his covered porch, the wooden boards groaning under his weight, and looked around. That's when he saw her, a figure huddled in the far corner where the porch wrapped around the side of the house, pressed against the wall, like she was trying to disappear into the shadows. "Hey," Luke said softly, the way he might speak to a wounded animal. "Are you okay?" The figure shifted, and in the dim light spilling from his living room window, he caught a glimpse of pale skin and dark hair plastered to a young woman's head. She was soaked through her clothes, clinging to her slight frame, and she clutched a battered suitcase against her chest like a shield. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I didn't mean to. I was just trying to get out of the rain. I'll go." She struggled to stand, but her legs seemed to give out, and she slumped back against the wall with a soft whimper. Luke's protective instincts, honed by years of single fatherhood, kicked in immediately. "Whoa, hold on," he said, moving closer, but keeping his distance. "You don't have to go anywhere. Are you hurt?" She shook her head, but even in the darkness he could see she was trembling. Whether from cold fear or exhaustion, he couldn't tell. Probably all three. "When's the last time you ate?" Luke asked. She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then, in a voice so small it broke his heart, "Tuesday, I think." Today was Friday. Luke ran a hand through his graying hair, weighing his options. Every rational part of his brain screamed warning signals. He had a 5-year-old son sleeping upstairs. He didn't know this woman from Eve. She could be dangerous, unstable, running from the law for all he knew. But looking at her now, this broken, rain-soaked girl, who couldn't be more than 25, all he saw was someone's daughter. Someone who needed help. "Look," he said finally. "I've got a spare room. It's not much, just a bed and a dresser, but it's dry and warm. You can stay the night, get cleaned up, and we'll figure things out in the morning. What do you say?" She looked up at him then, and even in the poor light, he could see the shock in her eyes. You'd do that for a stranger. Wouldn't be the first time, Luke said with a slight smile. Besides, my grandmother would come back and haunt me if I left someone out in a storm like this. She was big on hospitality. The young woman stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether he was real or some fever dream brought on by exhaustion and hunger. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." Luke extended his hand to help her up. "I'm Luke, by the way. Luke Bennett." She hesitated before taking his hand, her fingers ice-cold and delicate. "Claire," she said. "Claire Dawson." Even through the storm, Luke caught the slight pause before her last name, the way her eyes flickered away from his. But he didn't push. Everyone had secrets, and right now hers weren't his business. Getting her inside and warm, that was his business. He helped her to her feet, noticing how she favored her left ankle, and guided her toward the front door. "Watch the step there," he warned. "I keep meaning to fix that loose board." Inside, the warmth hit them both like a wall. Claire stood dripping in his entryway, still clutching her suitcase, looking around with wide eyes. Luke's house wasn't much to look at, a modest two-story built in the 1950s, with hardwood floors that needed refinishing and walls that could use a fresh coat of paint. But it was clean and comfortable, filled with the comfortable clutter of a life lived. Jacob's toys scattered across the living room floor, art projects stuck to the refrigerator with magnets, photos of better times lining the mantelpiece. "Let me grab you a towel," Luke said, disappearing down the hall. When he returned, Claire hadn't moved an inch. She stood exactly where he'd left her, water pooling at her feet, staring at a framed photo on the side table, Luke and Jacob at the beach last summer, both grinning and covered in sand. "That's my son Jacob," Luke said, handing her the towel. "He's 5. Sleeps like the dead, so don't worry about waking him." Claire took the towel but didn't use it immediately. Instead, she continued to stare at the photo. "He looks happy," she said softly. "He is mostly. Kids are resilient like that." Luke paused, then added, "It's just the two of us now." Something in his tone must have resonated with her because she looked up, then really looked at him for the first time. He was 42, though the stress of the past year had aged him. His brown hair was shot through with premature silver, and laugh lines had deepened into worry lines around his green eyes. He worked construction, and his hands showed it, calloused and scarred but gentle. There was kindness in his face, the kind that came from genuine caring rather than obligation. "I'm sorry," Claire said. "About whatever happened." Luke shrugged. "Life happens. We adapt." He gestured toward the stairs. "Your room's up here. There's a bathroom across the hall with fresh towels and toiletries. You're welcome to use whatever you need." He led her upstairs, past Jacob's room, where the door stood slightly ajar, revealing dinosaur-themed bedsheets and a nightlight shaped like a rocket ship. The spare room was at the end of the hall, small but clean, with a queen-sized bed, a wooden dresser that had seen better days, and a window that looked out over the backyard. "It's not the Ritz," Luke said apologetically, "but the mattress is decent and the sheets are clean." Claire set her suitcase on the bed and turned to face him. In the better light of the bedroom, he could see her more clearly. She was beautiful, ethereally so, with delicate features and large, dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of sadness. Her clothes, despite being soaked and wrinkled, were well made. Her boots, though scuffed, were expensive leather. There was something refined about her posture, the way she carried herself, that didn't quite match the story of a homeless girl with nowhere to go. "This is perfect," she said, and her voice caught slightly. "I can't thank you enough. I know this is unusual, taking in a stranger." We're all strangers until we're not, Luke replied. Are you hungry? I could make you something. You've done enough. When's the last time you had a hot meal? Luke interrupted gently. Claire's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, and she flushed with embarrassment. Tuesday, she admitted again. Grilled cheese and tomato soup coming up, Luke declared. It's Jacob's favorite, and I make a mean grilled cheese if I do say so myself. 20 minutes later, they sat across from each other at Luke's kitchen table, the storm still raging outside, but somehow less menacing now. Claire had changed into dry clothes, jeans, and a sweater that, like everything else about her, seemed too expensive for someone down on their luck. She'd also pulled her long, dark hair back into a simple ponytail, revealing a face that was even more striking, without the veil of wet hair. She ate like someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days, but with careful, deliberate movements that spoke of good breeding and careful upbringing. Luke watched her while pretending to focus on his own food, noting the way she held her spoon, the careful way she dabbed at her mouth with the napkin. So, he said finally, keeping his tone casual, what brings you to Millbrook? We're not exactly a destination town. Claire paused her spoon halfway to her mouth. I needed to get away from where I was. Millbrook seemed like a good place to start over. Running from something. She met his eyes then, and he saw steel beneath the vulnerability. Someone, she corrected. And yes, before you ask, it's not illegal. I'm not in trouble with the police or anything like that. I couldn't stay where I was anymore. Luke nodded. He understood about needing to escape, about starting over. Family trouble. You could say that. Claire took another spoonful of soup, then set down her spoon and really looked at him. Why are you being so kind to me? You don't know anything about me. I could be anyone. Luke considered the question seriously. My wife left us last year, he said finally. Just packed up one day while Jacob was at school and I was at work. Left a note saying she couldn't handle being a mother anymore, that she needed to find herself. Haven't seen or heard from her since. Claire's expression softened. I'm sorry. The thing is, Luke continued, for months after that I was angry. Angry at her, angry at the world, angry at God. Jacob would ask where Mommy went, and I didn't have any answers that made sense to a 4-year-old. But then one day, Mrs. Patterson from next door, she's about 80 and has more energy than me, she knocked on my door with a casserole and said something I'll never forget. What did she say? She said, Luke, honey, the world's got enough anger in it already. What it needs more of is kindness, especially the kind you don't expect. So I guess that's what I'm trying to do. Add a little unexpected kindness to the world. Claire was quiet for a long moment, absently stirring her soup. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I've never experienced kindness like this. Not without strings attached. There was something in the way she said it that made Luke's chest tighten. What kind of life had this young woman lived? That simple human decency seemed like a miracle to her. Well, get used to it, he said lightly. Millbrook's full of people like Mrs. Patterson. We look out for each other here. Is that why you stayed after your wife left? Luke glanced around his kitchen at the drawings Jacob had made in school, taped to the refrigerator at the coffee mug that said World's Best Dad in crooked crayon letters. This is home, he said simply. Roots matter. Community matters. Jacob's happy here, he's got friends, he's got stability. After everything that happened, I wanted to give him that. And what about what you want? The question caught him off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked him about his own desires, his own dreams. For the past year, everything had been about Jacob's needs, Jacob's happiness making sure his son felt secure and loved despite his mother's abandonment. "I want him to grow up knowing he's loved," Luke said finally. "I want him to believe in good people and happy endings. Everything else is just details." Claire studied his face with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect? Someone with ulterior motives, someone who'd want something in return." She paused. "Most people do." Again, that hint of a life lived in shadows of expectations and disappointments that had nothing to do with the kind of world Luke tried to create for his son. He found himself wanting to know more about this mysterious young woman, but also sensing that pushing too hard might send her running back into the storm. "Well, I do want something in return," he said with a slight grin. Claire tensed. "What? Help me finish this bottle of wine. It's been sitting in my fridge for 6 months, and I feel guilty drinking alone." The relief that washed over her face was so profound, it was almost painful to witness. "I think I can manage that," she said, and for the first time since he'd found her on his porch, she smiled. It transformed her entire face, erasing years of worry and fear, and replacing them with something luminous and warm. They moved to the living room where Luke built a fire in the old stone fireplace while Claire curled up on the couch with a glass of white wine, a bottle he'd been saving for a special occasion that never came. The wine loosened their tongues and lowered their guards, and slowly, carefully, they began to share pieces of themselves. Luke told her about his work, how he'd started Bennett Construction with nothing but a pickup truck and a toolbox, how he'd built it into a small but successful business that employed 12 people in their small town. He talked about Jacob's obsession with dinosaurs and space rockets, about the way his son's laughter could chase away even the darkest moods. Claire shared less but shared nonetheless. She talked about books. She was clearly well educated, dropping references to authors Luke had heard of but never read. She mentioned traveling places she'd been that sounded exotic and expensive. When Luke asked about her family, she grew quiet and simply said they were complicated and not really in the picture anymore. "What about work?" Luke asked as they settled deeper into the evening. "What did you do before you needed to start over?" Claire was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. She stared into the fire, swirling the wine in her glass, and something shadowed crossed her features. "I worked for my father's company," she said finally. "It didn't end well." "Family businesses can be tricky," Luke said diplomatically. "You have no idea." Claire took a long sip of wine. "What about you? Have you always lived in Millbrook? Born and raised, went away for college, studied business at State, but came back when my dad had his heart attack. He needed help with the construction company he'd started. I thought it would be temporary, but then I met Sarah Jacobs' mom and she was from here, so we stayed. Built a life here." "Do you ever regret it, staying?" Luke considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd taken that job in Chicago after college, or if I'd sold the business after Dad died and moved somewhere with more opportunities. But then I look at Jacob, at the life we've built, at the people who've become family. No, I don't regret it. Even after your wife left, especially after she left, when everything fell apart, this community held us together. Mrs. Patterson bringing meals when I was too overwhelmed to cook. Tom from the hardware store teaching Jacob how to build a birdhouse while I figured out how to file for divorce. The teachers at Jacob's school making sure he had extra support during the transition. You can't put a price on that kind of caring." Claire was quiet again, staring into the fire with an expression he couldn't read. "You're lucky," she said finally, "to have that kind of Foundation. We all need a foundation, Luke replied. Something solid to build on. What's yours? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'm still figuring that out. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence with warmth and light. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, the thunder moving further away, and the rain settling into a steady patter against the windows. Luke found himself studying Clare's profile in the firelight, noting the way the flames brought out golden highlights in her dark hair, the elegant line of her neck, the sadness that seemed to cling to her like perfume. "Luke," she said, suddenly turning to face him, "why haven't you asked me more questions about where I came from, why I'm really here, why I was hiding on your porch in the middle of a storm?" He met her gaze steadily. "Because everyone deserves the right to their own story. When you're ready to tell it, I'll listen. Until then, it's enough that you're here and you're safe." Something shifted in her expression, then surprise giving way to something deeper, more profound. "I've never met anyone like you," she whispered. "Good different or bad different, dangerously different." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she immediately looked away, color rising in her cheeks. "Dangerous how?" Claire stood abruptly, setting down her wine glass with hands that trembled slightly. "I should get some sleep. Tomorrow I'll start looking for a more permanent place to stay and maybe some work. Claire." Luke stood as well, moving carefully so as not to spook her. "You don't have to run. Whatever you're afraid of, whatever you're running from, you're safe here." She turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw a war being fought between hope and fear, between the desire to trust and the terror of being vulnerable. "You don't understand," she said softly. "I'm not who you think I am. I don't think you're anyone except a woman who needed help on a stormy night. Everything else is just details." For a moment he thought she might say more, might finally trust him with whatever secret she was carrying. But then she stepped back, rebuilding the walls he'd watched her lower throughout the evening. "Thank you," she said formally. "For dinner, for the room, for treating me like a human being. I'll be gone in the morning." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." She was already moving toward the stairs, her posture rigid with determination. "Good night, Luke." He watched her go, noting the way she moved, graceful, despite her exhaustion, purposeful, despite her obvious fear. At the foot of the stairs, she paused and looked back at him. "For what it's worth," she said quietly. "Your son is lucky to have you as a father. And someday, when he's older, he's going to understand what an extraordinary man raised him." Before Luke could respond, she was gone, her footsteps light on the stairs, leaving him alone with the dying fire and a dozen unanswered questions. Upstairs, Claire closed the bedroom door behind her and leaned against it, her heart racing. In the space of a few hours, this man, this stranger, had shown her more genuine kindness than she'd experienced in years. No agenda, no expectations, no demands for information or favors or anything in return except help finishing a bottle of wine. She moved to the window and looked out at the storm, which was finally beginning to clear. In the distance, she could see the lights of the town Millbrook, population 8,000 sound, a place so small it probably didn't even appear on most maps. A place where a man could build a construction business with his bare hands and raise his son to believe in happy endings. A place where neighbors brought casseroles and taught children to build birdhouses and asked no questions when strangers needed shelter. She thought about her father's mansion in the hills outside the state capitol, with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers and rooms so large they echoed when you walked through them. She thought about the boardrooms and charity galas and carefully orchestrated social events where every smile was calculated and every conversation had an underlying agenda. She thought about the weight of the Montgomery name, the expectations and obligations, and the crushing realization that none of it, not the money or the power or the influence, had ever made her feel as safe as she'd felt sitting by Luke Bennett's fireplace sharing wine and honest conversation. But safety was an illusion, and she knew better than most that happiness built on lies never lasted. Tomorrow she would leave before Luke and his son became collateral damage in the war between her and her father. Before Richard Montgomery's reach extended to this small town and destroyed another innocent family in his quest to control every aspect of his daughter's life. She pulled her phone from her suitcase and turned it on for the first time in 3 days. Immediately, it began buzzing with missed calls and text messages, dozens of them, all from her father's associates, all variations on the same theme: come home. Stop this foolishness. Your father is willing to forgive if you return immediately. The last message was from her father himself, sent just 2 hours ago. Claire, this has gone far enough. You have 24 hours to return home, or I will use every resource at my disposal to find you and bring you back. You are my daughter, and you will not embarrass this family further. She turned off the phone and buried it in the bottom of her suitcase. 24 hours. She'd managed to stay hidden for 3 days by using cash and avoiding security cameras, but she knew her father's reach was long and his resources virtually unlimited. If Richard Montgomery wanted to find her, he would. The only question was whether she could get far enough away from Millbrook and from Luke and Jacob before that happened. She lay down on the bed, still fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, she could hear Luke moving around downstairs, banking the fire, washing the wine glasses, turning off lights. Normal domestic sounds that spoke of a life lived with purpose and contentment. The sounds of home. For just a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to stay. To wake up tomorrow and make breakfast for Luke and Jacob, to help the little boy get ready for school, to kiss Luke goodbye as he left for work, like they were a real family. To build something genuine and lasting in this place where kindness was offered without expectation and roots ran deep enough to weather any storm. But fairy tales were for children who still believed in happy endings, and Claire had learned long ago that some people were born to lives of complications and consequences. She was Richard Montgomery's daughter with all the privileges and curses that entailed, and men like Luke Bennett, good men, honest men, men who believed in the fundamental decency of human nature, they deserved better than to be dragged into the ugly realities of her world. So she would leave in the morning before he woke up, before Jacob came downstairs looking for breakfast and found a stranger at their kitchen table. She would leave a note thanking him for his kindness and some money to cover the cost of the room and food, not enough to insult him, but enough to show her gratitude. And then she would disappear back into the world of bus stations and cheap motels and cities where no one knew her name or cared about her story. It was better this way, safer for everyone involved. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, Claire Dawson, Claire Montgomery, allowed herself one last moment of pretending. In her dreams, she woke up to the smell of coffee and pancakes, to the sound of Luke's voice and Jacob's laughter, to the possibility of a life where love wasn't a transaction and family wasn't a business arrangement. In her dreams, she stayed. Downstairs, Luke finished cleaning up and made his way to his own bedroom, but sleep eluded him. There was something about Claire that didn't add up: the expensive clothes, the cultured accent that occasionally slipped through her careful diction, the way she'd looked at his simple home like it was something precious and rare. Most telling of all was the fear in her eyes when she'd said she wasn't who he thought she was, as if her true identity was something dangerous, something that could bring harm to the people around her. He'd seen that kind of fear before, in the women who occasionally showed up at the domestic violence shelter where he volunteered doing carpentry work and repairs. It was the look of someone who'd learned that caring about people could be used against you, that love could be weaponized by those who were supposed to protect you. Whatever Claire was running from, whoever she was really afraid of, Luke found himself hoping she would trust him enough to stay and fight instead of running. Millbrook might be small, but it was the kind of place where people stood together against outside threats. The kind of place where a woman could start over and build something new if she was brave enough to try. But as he finally fell asleep, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that morning would bring an empty room and another goodbye, and that this time losing someone might hurt more than he was prepared to handle. The storm passed in the night, leaving behind a world washed clean and gleaming with possibility. But some storms Luke was beginning to realize were just the beginning of much larger tempests to come. And sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was open your door to a stranger in the rain and discover that what you'd really been doing was opening your heart to a future you never saw coming. The first thing that struck Luke when he woke the next morning wasn't the sunlight streaming through his bedroom window or the unusual silence from Jacob's room. It was the smell of coffee brewing and something sweet baking in his kitchen. He lay still for a moment, wondering if he was dreaming before the events of the previous night came flooding back. Clare. The storm. The mysterious young woman who'd looked at his simple home like it was a palace, and his basic kindness like it was a miracle. He pulled on jeans and a t-shirt, and padded downstairs, following the intoxicating aroma of what smelled like fresh biscuits. In his kitchen, he found Claire standing at the stove, her dark hair pulled back in a loose bun, wearing the same clothes from the night before, but somehow looking completely different. There was color in her cheeks now, and she moved around his kitchen with surprising confidence, as if she belonged there. "Good morning," she said softly, when she noticed him in the doorway. "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to make breakfast as a thank you, but I had to improvise with what you had in the pantry." Luke looked around his kitchen in amazement. Not only had she managed to make biscuits from scratch, something he'd never attempted, but she'd also found ingredients for what looked like homemade jam and had fresh coffee waiting. The kitchen, which usually bore the comfortable chaos of single fatherhood, was spotless. Even the dishes from last night had been washed and put away. "You didn't have to do this," he said, though he couldn't hide his appreciation. "I thought you'd be gone by now." Claire's hands stilled on the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir something on the stove. "I was planning to leave early before you woke up, but then I heard Jacob crying." As if summoned by his name, Jacob's voice drifted down from upstairs, not crying now, but chattering excitedly about something. Luke frowned, moving toward the stairs, but Claire caught his arm gently. "He had a nightmare," she explained, "about his mom. He was calling for her, and when he realized she wasn't coming, he got upset. I heard him from my room, and I hope it was okay, but I went in to check on him." Luke's chest tightened. Jacob still had nightmares about Sarah's departure moments when he'd wake up and temporarily forget that his mother was gone. Usually it took Luke 20 minutes of gentle reassurance to calm his son down again. "What did you do?" he asked. A soft smile played at the corners of Claire's mouth. "I told him a story about a little boy who went on adventures with friendly dinosaurs. He fell back asleep before I finished, but when he woke up this morning, he asked if I was the story lady and if I could tell him another one." "Daddy," Jacob's voice called from upstairs, followed by the thundering of small feet on the stairs. "Daddy, the story lady is here. She makes voices for all the dinosaurs." Jacob burst into the kitchen wearing his favorite dinosaur pajamas, his brown hair sticking up in all directions. He stopped short when he saw Claire suddenly shy and pressed himself against Luke's leg. "Remember we talked about this, buddy?" Luke said, gently smoothing down his son's hair. This is Claire. She stayed in our guest room last night because of the storm. Are you really the story lady? Jacob asked Claire, peeking at her from behind Luke's leg. Claire knelt down to Jacob's eye level, her expression gentle and patient. I suppose I am. Would you like to hear another story while we eat breakfast? Jacob nodded enthusiastically, his shyness evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. Can it be about the T-Rex who was afraid of butterflies? A T-Rex afraid of butterflies. Claire pretended to consider this seriously. That sounds like a very important story. I think I know just the one. Over breakfast, the best biscuits Luke had ever tasted, served with homemade strawberry jam that she'd somehow created from frozen berries, Claire wove an elaborate tale about Rex, the T-Rex, who was the fiercest dinosaur in the valley, until the day he encountered a beautiful monarch butterfly. Jacob hung on every word, giggling, when Claire used different voices for each character, and gasping at the dramatic moments. Luke found himself equally captivated not just by the story, but by watching Claire with his son. She had a natural gift with children, responding to Jacob's endless questions and interruptions with patience and genuine interest. More than that, she seemed to understand something fundamental about storytelling, that for a 5-year-old, the best stories weren't just entertainment, but a way of making sense of the world. And that's how Rex learned that being strong doesn't mean you can't be gentle, Claire concluded, as Jacob finished his last bite of biscuit, and that sometimes the most beautiful things in life are also the most delicate. That's the best story ever, Jacob declared. Will you tell me another one tonight? Claire glanced at Luke, uncertainty flickering across her features. Well, I'm not sure if I'll still be here tonight. Why not? Jacob asked with the blunt curiosity of childhood. Don't you live here now? Jacob, Luke said gently. Claire is just visiting. She has her own home to go back to. But even as he said it, Luke realized he didn't want it to be true. Watching Claire at his kitchen table, seeing the way she'd cared for Jacob during his nightmare, feeling the warmth and life she'd brought to his house in just one morning, it felt right in a way that caught him completely off guard. Actually, he found himself saying, "You're welcome to stay as long as you need to. I meant what I said last night about figuring things out in the morning." Claire looked at him with those dark eyes that held too much sadness for someone so young. Luke, I can't ask you to. You're not asking, I'm offering. He stood and began clearing the breakfast dishes, his movements casual but his tone serious. Look, I don't know what you're running from, and I won't push you to tell me. But this is a good place to catch your breath and figure out your next move. Jacob clearly likes having you here. The guest room is just sitting empty. And to be honest, it's nice having adult conversation that doesn't revolve around dinosaurs and rocket ships. Can she stay, Daddy? Jacob chimed in, climbing down from his chair to stand next to Claire. She makes the best stories and she smells like flowers, and she didn't tell me to stop asking questions like Mrs. Henderson does. Claire laughed, a genuine sound that transformed her entire face. Mrs. Henderson, the babysitter, Luke explained. She's efficient. She's mean, Jacob said matter-of-factly. And she makes gross sandwiches with the crusts still on. Jacob Bennett, we don't call people mean, Luke chided, but his heart wasn't in it. Mrs. Henderson was indeed rather stern, and her idea of childcare seemed to involve a lot of television and very little interaction. Sorry, Daddy. Jacob turned back to Claire with hopeful eyes. But you'll stay, right? At least until tonight, so you can tell me about the butterfly dinosaurs, friend. Claire looked between father and son, and Luke could see the war being fought behind her eyes. Whatever she was afraid of, whoever she was hiding, from the desire to stay, was clearly battling with her need to keep running. Just for a few days, Luke said quietly, until you figure out your next step. No pressure, no questions asked. "I don't have any money," Claire said suddenly, as if honesty might scare him away. "I can't pay rent. You just made the best breakfast I've had in months. You calmed my son down from a nightmare better than I could have, and you've brought more life to this house in 12 hours than it's seen all year," Luke replied. "Trust me, you're earning your keep." Claire was quiet for a long moment, absently smoothing Jacob's unruly hair, while he leaned against her chair. Finally, she nodded. "A few days," she agreed. "Just until I can figure out what comes next." "Yay!" Jacob cheered, throwing his arms around Claire's waist in an impromptu hug that clearly caught her off guard. For a moment, she sat frozen as if physical affection was something foreign and unexpected. Then her arms came up to hug him back, and the expression on her face was so tender and surprised that Luke felt something shift in his chest. The next few days fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and extraordinary. Claire took over many of the household tasks that Luke had been juggling badly since Sarah's departure. Not in a way that made him feel useless or displaced, but like a partner sharing the load. She cooked meals that were somehow both elegant and comforting. Simple ingredients transformed into something special through techniques Luke had never seen. She kept the house cleaner than it had been in months, but without making him feel criticized for his previous efforts. Most importantly, she was wonderful with Jacob. She listened to his rambling stories about school with genuine interest, helped him with homework, without making him feel stupid when he struggled, and created elaborate games that kept him entertained for hours. Her storytelling became a nightly ritual that Jacob looked forward to all day, tales of brave knights and clever princesses and animals who learned important lessons about friendship and courage. But it was the small moments that really got to Luke. The way Claire would absently hum while she cooked, filling the house with music. How she'd learned to make Jacob's lunch exactly the way he liked it. Peanut butter and jelly cut into triangles, apple slices with a little lemon juice so they wouldn't turn brown, and a note with a funny drawing. The sound of her laugh when Jacob told one of his nonsensical 5-year-old jokes. The comfortable silence they'd found during the evening hours after Jacob went to bed, when they'd sit together in the living room, reading or watching television content in each other's company. Luke found himself looking forward to coming home from work, knowing that Claire would be there. Not because he needed someone to take care of his house or his son he'd been managing fine on his own, but because she made everything better just by being present. She brought a grace and warmth to their daily routines that made ordinary moments feel special. But even as he was falling into this new normal, Luke couldn't ignore the signs that Claire was still carrying secrets. She never used her phone, which struck him as odd for someone her age. She flinched whenever a car door slammed unexpectedly or when the doorbell rang. Most telling of all, she never talked about her past in anything but the vaguest terms. When Jacob asked about her family, she'd smoothly redirect the conversation. When neighbors stopped by and were introduced to her, she was polite but guarded, never volunteering information about herself. Still, Luke had meant what he'd said about not pushing for answers. Whatever Claire's story was, she'd tell him when she was ready. In the meantime, he was content to enjoy this unexpected gift, this brief period, when his house felt like a home again, and Jacob had someone who made him feel special and heard. It was on Thursday evening, nearly a week after Claire had arrived, that Luke began to realize just how much mystery surrounded his houseguest. He'd come home from work to find her in the kitchen as usual, something delicious simmering on the stove, and Jacob at the table working on a math worksheet while she helped him sound out the word problems. "Daddy," Jacob called when he heard the front door. "Claire taught me how to make paper airplanes that actually fly. Want to see? After dinner, buddy," Luke replied, hanging his jacket on the hook by the door. "Something smells incredible in here." "Coco vin," Claire said, stirring the pot with practiced ease. I found some wine in your pantry and thought I'd try something a little more ambitious than usual. Luke paused, watching her work. She moved around the kitchen with the confidence of someone who'd been trained by professionals, her knife work precise and efficient, as she prepared a side of vegetables. This wasn't the cooking of someone who'd learned from necessity or from watching cooking shows. This was the technique of someone who'd had formal training. Where did you learn to cook like this? He asked, keeping his tone casual. Claire's hands stilled for just a moment before resuming their work. My mother, she said simply. She believed that cooking was one of the most important life skills you could have. She taught me that a good meal could solve almost any problem. She sounds wise, is she? She died when I was 16. Claire's voice was steady, but Luke caught the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for the salt. Cancer. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. Claire turned to check on something in the oven, effectively ending the conversation, but not before Luke saw to the grief that flickered across her face. After dinner, which was indeed restaurant quality, Luke was helping Claire with the dishes when he noticed something that made him pause. As she reached up to put a plate in the cabinet, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing what looked like the edge of an expensive watch. Not the kind of watch someone down on their luck would typically own unless... That's a beautiful watch, he commented casually. Claire glanced down at her wrist and immediately tugged her sleeve down to cover it. It was my mother's, she said quickly. One of the few things I kept when I had to leave. It was a reasonable explanation, but something about the way she said it didn't quite ring true. Combined with her designer clothes, her refined manners, and her obvious education, a picture was starting to form that didn't match the story of a woman with nowhere to go and no money to her name. Luke finished drying the last plate and hung up the towel, studying Claire's profile as she wiped down the counters. Whatever her real story was, it was clearly more complicated than she'd let on. The question was whether she was in some kind of trouble or if she was simply someone trying to escape a life of privilege for reasons of her own. Either way, he realized it didn't change how he felt about having her here. Claire had brought joy and stability to his home, had given Jacob a female figure who cared about him, and had somehow made Luke remember what it felt like to have a partner in the daily business of living. Whatever secrets she was keeping, they were hers to keep until she chose otherwise. But that night, as he was saying goodnight to Jacob, his son asked a question that made Luke realize just how attached they'd both become to their temporary house guest. Daddy, Jacob said, snuggled under his dinosaur blankets, with his favorite stuffed T-Rex, is Claire going to be my new mommy? Luke sat down on the edge of the bed, choosing his words carefully. What makes you ask that, buddy? Well, she makes breakfast and tells stories and helps with homework like mommies do. And she doesn't leave like regular babysitters. And... Jacob paused, thinking seriously. She looks at me the way you do, like she really likes me. Luke's heart clenched. She does really like you, Jacob. We both can see that. So will she stay forever? This was dangerous territory, Luke knew. Jacob had already been abandoned by one woman he'd trusted to be permanent. The last thing he wanted was to set his son up for another disappointment. Claire is staying with us for a little while, but she has her own life to figure out, Luke said gently. She might need to leave someday to take care of her own things. That doesn't mean she doesn't care about us. It just means that sometimes grown-ups have complicated situations to work through. Jacob was quiet for a moment, absently stroking his stuffed dinosaur's head. I hope she doesn't go, he said finally. I like having her here. The house feels happier. I like having her here too, Luke admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of it. Maybe if we're really, really good, she'll want to stay. Jacob suggested with the earnest hope of childhood. Maybe, Luke said, though he had a growing feeling that Claire's reasons for potentially leaving had nothing to do with them and everything to do with whatever she was running from. But even if she does leave, that doesn't mean she doesn't care about us. Okay? Sometimes people have to make hard choices that don't have anything to do with love. After Jacob fell asleep, Luke found Clare in the living room, curled up on the couch, with a book Dostoevsky. He noticed not exactly light reading. She'd changed into what she called her lounging clothes, a soft sweater and yoga pants that somehow managed to look elegant on her. In the lamplight, with her hair loose around her shoulders and her guard down, she looked both beautiful and heartbreakingly young. "Good book?" he asked, settling into his usual chair with his own book, a much less ambitious thriller. "Crime and Punishment," she replied with a slight smile. "Not exactly bedtime reading, I know, but I've always found Russian literature soothing somehow. All that angst and philosophical suffering makes my own problems seem manageable by comparison." "What kind of problems require Dostoevsky to put in perspective?" Luke asked, then immediately held up his hand. "Sorry, that was pushier than I meant to be." Claire closed the book and looked at him seriously. "Luke, can I ask you something?" "Shoot." "If you discovered that someone you cared about had been lying to you, not about anything harmful, but about who they really were, would you be able to forgive them?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications. Luke set down his own book and gave her his full attention. "That would depend on why they were lying," he said carefully. "Were they trying to hurt someone? Were they protecting themselves? Were they afraid?" "Afraid," Claire said quietly. "Definitely afraid." "Then I'd want to understand what they were afraid of, and I'd hope they'd trust me enough eventually to tell me the truth." Claire was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire that Luke had built earlier. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What if the truth could put people you cared about in danger?" Luke felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "What kind of danger, Claire?" She looked at him then, and he saw fear in her eyes, not the general anxiety of someone down on their luck, but the specific terror of someone who knew exactly what she was afraid of. "The kind that comes from powerful people who don't like to be told no," she said. "The kind that comes from families who think they own the people they're supposed to love." Luke leaned forward in his chair. "Are you in some kind of trouble? Because if you are, if someone's threatening you—" "Not threatening," Claire interrupted. "Controlling. There's a difference, though. I'm not sure it matters much in practical terms." Before Luke could respond, they were interrupted by a sound that made Claire go completely rigid. The rumble of an expensive car engine in the driveway, followed by the slam of car doors. Claire was on her feet, instantly moving to the window and peering through the curtains with the practiced stealth of someone who'd done this before. "Oh, God," she breathed, her face going pale. "He found me." "Who found you?" Luke was standing now too, every protective instinct firing. "My father." Claire turned away from the window, her composure cracking for the first time since he'd known her. "Luke, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I thought I had more time." Before Luke could ask what she meant, the doorbell rang, a sharp, authoritative sound that seemed to echo through the house like a challenge. From upstairs came the sound of Jacob stirring, roused by the unexpected noise. Claire looked at Luke with eyes full of panic and regret. "I have to go with them," she said rapidly. "If I don't, they'll make trouble for you and Jacob, and I can't let that happen. Just, please don't think badly of me, and tell Jacob that I'm sorry I couldn't say goodbye properly." She was already moving toward the stairs, presumably to get her things, when Luke caught her arm. "Wait," he said firmly. "Just wait. Let's see what they want before you make any decisions." The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time, followed by a sharp knock. "Luke, you don't understand," Claire said urgently. "These aren't people you can reason with. They're people who are used to getting what they want no matter what it costs other people." "Then maybe it's time someone showed them what happens when they mess with people who fight back," Luke replied, his voice carrying a steel that surprised even him. For a moment, Claire stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. Then, incredibly, she smiled a real smile that lit up her entire face despite the fear still evident in her eyes. "You have no idea what you're saying," she whispered. "Then explain it to me," Luke replied. "But first, let's answer the door together. Whatever this is, whatever your real story is, you don't have to face it alone." The knocking came again, more demanding now, and Luke could hear Jacob's voice calling from upstairs. Claire looked toward the sound, then back at Luke, and something in her expression shifted from fear to determination. "Okay," she said quietly. "But Luke, when you find out who I really am, please remember that everything I've felt here, everything I've shared with you and Jacob, that was real. That was the most real I've ever been." Luke nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was agreeing to. Together they moved toward the front door, where Claire's past was waiting to collide with the small, safe world they'd built together. And as Luke reached for the doorknob, he realized that whatever happened next would change everything, not just for Claire, but for all of them. The storm that had brought Claire to his door had been nothing compared to the tempest that was about to break over their heads. But as he looked at the woman beside him, this mysterious, complicated, beautiful woman who'd made his house a home again, Luke knew he wasn't about to let her face it alone. Luke's hand was steady as he turned the doorknob, but he could feel the tension radiating from Claire beside him, like heat from a flame. The door swung open to reveal two men in expensive suits standing on his porch, one older with silver hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw, the other younger and built like security, his hand resting casually near what Luke suspected was a concealed weapon. Behind them, parked in his modest driveway like a predator among sheep, sat a black Mercedes sedan with tinted windows and government plates. "Good evening," the older man said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from never being questioned. "I'm looking for my daughter. I believe she's been staying here." Luke felt Claire go rigid beside him, but when he glanced at her, her face had transformed into a mask of cold composure that he'd never seen before. Gone was the warm, vulnerable woman who'd told bedtime stories and made biscuits from scratch. In her place stood someone who looked like she'd been born wearing armor. "Father," she said, her voice steady but empty of any emotion. "I wondered when you'd find me." "Claire Elizabeth Montgomery," the man replied, and Luke felt the ground shift beneath his feet as the pieces clicked into place. Montgomery. As in Montgomery Industries, the massive conglomerate that owned half the state's infrastructure. As in Richard Montgomery, the billionaire whose face appeared on magazine covers and whose political influence reached into every corner of state government. "Aren't you going to invite us in?" Richard Montgomery continued, though it wasn't really a question. He was already stepping forward, assuming entry, the way powerful men always did, as if the entire world existed for their convenience. "Actually, I'd prefer if you stayed right where you are," Luke said, not moving from the doorway. "This is my home and you weren't invited." Richard's cold gaze shifted to Luke for the first time, taking in his worn jeans and work shirt, the calluses on his hands, the modest house behind him. The assessment was swift and dismissive. "Mr. Bennett, isn't it?" Richard said, and the fact that he already knew Luke's name sent a chill down his spine. I appreciate you providing temporary shelter for my daughter during her episode, but I'm here to take her home now where she belongs. Episode. Luke repeated, anger beginning to build in his chest. Is that what you call it when your daughter makes her own choices? I call it what it is, Richard replied smoothly. A young woman having a breakdown after the death of her fiancé, acting out in grief and confusion. Surely you can understand that she's not in her right mind. Luke felt Claire flinch beside him, and when he looked at her, he saw pain flash across her features before the mask slipped back into place. I'm perfectly in my right mind, Father, Claire said, her voice like ice. And David wasn't my fiancé. He was your business partner's son and your chosen successor. I never agreed to marry him. You would have in time, Richard said with the casual certainty of someone discussing the weather. David understood your value to the company. He would have been patient with your romantic notions. My romantic notions. Claire's composure cracked slightly, and Luke heard the first hint of real emotion in her voice. You mean my desire to actually love the person I marry? My belief that marriage should be about more than corporate mergers? David is dead now, Richard said bluntly, so that particular arrangement is no longer relevant. We've made other plans for your future. Daddy? Jacob's small voice drifted down from the top of the stairs, where he stood in his pajamas rubbing his eyes and looking confused. What's happening? Who are the strange men? Luke's protective instincts blazed to life. Jacob, go back to your room, buddy. I'll be up in a minute. But Richard Montgomery's attention had already shifted to the little boy, and something predatory flickered in his eyes. So this is where you've been playing house? He said to Claire. How quaint. Don't, Claire said sharply, and for the first time since her father had arrived, Luke heard real fear in her voice. Don't you dare involve them in this. Involve them. Richard smiled, and it was like watching a shark bare its teeth. My dear daughter, they involved themselves the moment they harbored a fugitive. Fugitive. Luke stepped forward, his hands clenching into fists. She's not a fugitive. She's a grown woman who chose to leave her father's house. Mr. Bennett. The younger man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a subtle threat. I think you should step aside and let us handle this family matter. Like hell I will, Luke replied, not moving an inch. Claire, what do you want to do? Because whatever you decide, we'll support you. Claire looked at him with something like wonder in her eyes, as if the concept of being asked what she wanted was foreign to her experience. Then her gaze shifted to Jacob, still standing at the top of the stairs, and Luke saw her expression crumble. I have to go with them, she said quietly. If I don't, they'll find ways to hurt you. They'll shut down your business, get Jacob taken away, destroy everything you've built here. These people don't make idle threats, Luke. Try us, Luke said, his voice deadly quiet. I've been dealing with bullies my whole life, and money doesn't make them any scarier. Richard Montgomery laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. Mr. Bennett, but you have no idea who you're dealing with. I own 3 banks in this county, including the one that holds your mortgage. I have relationships with every major contractor in the state who might hire your little company. I know people in Child Protective Services who could have your son removed from your home within hours based on nothing more than an anonymous tip about unsafe living conditions. The casual way he delivered these threats, as if he were discussing the weather, made Luke's blood run cold. But instead of backing down, he felt his resolve harden. And I know people too, Luke said evenly. People who believe in doing what's right, regardless of how much money someone has. People who don't like seeing families torn apart by greedy men who think money gives them the right to control other people's lives. Luke, please, Claire whispered, touching his arm. You don't understand what he's capable of. I've seen him destroy people who had much more power than you do." "Then maybe it's time someone stood up to him," Luke replied, not taking his eyes off Richard Montgomery. "Maybe it's time someone showed him that not everything in this world is for sale." Richard's expression shifted, and for the first time Luke saw genuine interest in his eyes. "You fascinate me, Mr. Bennett. Most people in your position would be calculating how much money it would take to make this problem go away. But you're actually prepared to fight me over a woman you've known for less than a week." "I'm prepared to fight you over the principle," Luke corrected. "Over the idea that your daughter has the right to make her own choices about her life. Over the belief that love and family should mean protection, not control." "Love?" Richard's eyebrows rose mockingly. "How wonderfully romantic. Tell me, Mr. Bennett, are you in love with my daughter?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Luke felt Clare's sharp intake of breath beside him. He could have deflected, could have insisted this was just about doing the right thing. Instead, he found himself looking at Clare, really looking at her and seeing past the mask she'd put on for her father, to the woman who'd made his house a home, who'd cared for his son like he was her own, who'd brought light and laughter back into their lives. "Yes," he said simply, "I am." Clare's eyes widened in shock, and even Richard Montgomery seemed taken aback by the directness of the admission. "How inconvenient," Richard said after a moment. "Clare, darling, surely you're not going to let this man ruin his life over some misguided romantic gesture. He has a child to think about." Clare looked between Luke and her father, and Luke could see the war being fought behind her eyes. The desire to stay, to fight, to choose love over duty, warring with years of conditioning, and the very real fear of what her father could do to the people she cared about. "Clare," Luke said softly, drawing her attention back to him, "what do you want? Not what's practical, not what's safe, not what other people expect. What do you want?" For a moment, Clare's mask slipped completely, and Luke saw the real woman beneath, vulnerable, scared, but also strong in ways she probably didn't even realize. "I want to stay," she whispered so quietly that only Luke could hear. "I want to wake up tomorrow and make pancakes for Jacob and listen to you talk about your work and pretend that I'm just a normal woman who fell in love with a good man." "Then stay," Luke said, reaching for her hand. "We'll figure out the rest together." But before Clare could respond, Richard Montgomery played his trump card. "How touching," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Clare, perhaps you should tell Mr. Bennett about David, about how he died." Clare went white, her hand jerking away from Luke's, as if she'd been burned. "Father, no." "She didn't tell you." Richard continued, his smile widening. "David Miller, my former business partner's son, died in a car accident 3 weeks ago. He was driving to confront Clare about her refusal to announce their engagement. He was upset, driving too fast in the rain, lost control of his car." "It wasn't my fault," Clare said, but her voice was hollow, and Luke could see the guilt eating her alive. "Wasn't it?" Richard pressed. "If you'd simply agreed to the marriage as you were supposed to, David would still be alive. His family certainly blames you. They've made it quite clear that seeing you prosecuted for his death would bring them some measure of comfort." "Prosecuted for what?" Luke demanded. "For not wanting to marry someone. For reckless endangerment leading to death," Richard replied smoothly. "For deliberately provoking someone into a dangerous emotional state. It's a stretch legally, but David's family has excellent lawyers and deep pockets. They could make Clare's life very difficult." Clare was shaking now, the guilt and pain she'd been carrying finally spilling over. "He called me that night," she said, her voice barely audible. David called me screaming about how I was humiliating him, how I was destroying his future. He said he was coming to talk to me, and I told him not to. I told him to leave me alone, that I would never marry him no matter what. The last thing I said to him was that I wished he would just disappear from my life. And he did, Richard said with cruel satisfaction. Permanently. Luke felt his heart breaking for Clare, understanding now why she'd been running, why she'd looked so haunted when he first found her. She wasn't just escaping her father's control, she was drowning in guilt over a man's death, even though it clearly wasn't her fault. "Clare," he said gently, looking at me. She raised her eyes to his, and he saw the same broken expression he'd seen in the mirror after Sarah left, the look of someone who blamed themselves for things beyond their control. "David's death wasn't your fault," Luke said firmly. "Refusing to marry someone isn't a crime. Standing up for yourself isn't murder. You can't be held responsible for someone else's choices, no matter how tragic the consequences." "The courts might disagree," Richard interjected, "especially if David's family decides to pursue wrongful death charges. Claire could face years in prison." "Only if she goes back," Luke said, the pieces falling into place. "That's what this is about, isn't it? You need her back under your control to manage the legal situation, to make whatever deals you've already arranged with David's family." Richard's smile widened. "Very good, Mr. Bennett. You're more perceptive than I gave you credit for. Yes, I've reached an understanding with the Miller family. They'll forego any legal action against Claire in exchange for her cooperation with certain business arrangements. But that cooperation requires her to be where I can ensure her compliance." "What kind of business arrangements?" Luke asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew. "A merger between Montgomery Industries and Miller Holdings," Richard replied. "Claire will take over David's position in the company and eventually marry his younger brother James. It's a slightly less advantageous arrangement than the original plan, but it accomplishes the same goals." Claire made a sound like a wounded animal. "James is 17 years old. He'll be 18 in 6 months, Richard said dismissively. "Old enough to marry, young enough to be molded into a proper husband. Really, Claire, your objections are becoming tiresome." Luke felt rage like he'd never experienced building in his chest. "You're talking about selling your daughter to a child to close a business deal." "I'm talking about securing my daughter's future," Richard corrected. "About ensuring that she takes her proper place in society instead of playing house with a small-town contractor." "This is insane," Luke said, turning to Claire. "You can't seriously be considering this." But Claire wasn't looking at him anymore. She was staring at the floor, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, and Luke realized that she was breaking under the weight of guilt and fear and years of psychological manipulation. "Claire," he said urgently, "listen to me. You are not responsible for David's death. You are not property to be traded. You are a grown woman with the right to make your own choices about your life." "Choices have consequences, Mr. Bennett," Richard said coldly. "And sometimes those consequences affect innocent people, like your son upstairs." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Luke felt his blood turn to ice. "If you so much as—" "I won't have to do anything," Richard interrupted. "If Claire chooses to stay here and fight this legal battle, it will become a media circus. Reporters will descend on your little town like locusts. Your business will suffer. Your son will be followed by photographers on his way to school. Is that really the life you want for him?" Luke looked at Jacob, still standing at the top of the stairs, confused and frightened by the tension he could feel, even if he didn't understand it. His son had already been through so much with his mother's abandonment. Did Luke have the right to expose him to more trauma for the sake of a woman he'd known for a week? But as he wrestled with the impossible choice, Jacob did something that changed everything. Instead of retreating to his room as Luke had instructed, the little boy came down the stairs and walked straight to Clare, taking her hand in his small one. "Are you sad?" Jacob asked, looking up at her with the uncomplicated concern of childhood. Clare knelt down to his level, tears streaming down her face now. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm very sad." "Is it because the mean men want to take you away?" Clare glanced at Richard, who was watching this exchange with obvious distaste, then back at Jacob. "Something like that." "Well, you don't have to go if you don't want to," Jacob said with the simple logic of a 5-year-old. "This is your home too now. You live here with me and Daddy." "It's not that simple, Jacob," Clare said gently. "Why not?" Jacob asked. "If someone's being mean to you, you tell them to stop. And if they don't stop, you get Daddy to make them stop. That's what you do with bullies." Out of the mouths of babes, Luke thought. His 5-year-old son had just summed up the situation more clearly than any of the adults in the room. "The little boy has a point," Luke said, standing up straighter. "Mr. Montgomery, I think it's time for you to leave." "I'm not leaving without my daughter," Richard replied, his voice hardening. "Yes, you are," Luke said firmly. "Because this is my property, and I'm asking you to leave. If you refuse, I'll call the police and have you removed for trespassing." "The police," Richard laughed. "Mr. Bennett, I own the mayor of this town. I've donated more money to the local police department than you'll make in a lifetime. Who do you think they're going to believe?" "They're going to believe the man who grew up here," Luke replied evenly. "The man whose family has lived in this community for 3 generations. The man who coaches Little League and volunteers at the fire department and shows up when his neighbors need help. Money might buy you a lot of things, Mr. Montgomery, but it can't buy you the kind of trust that comes from being part of a community." For the first time since he'd arrived, Richard Montgomery looked uncertain. He was used to operating in a world where power and wealth were the only currencies that mattered. The idea that there might be places where those currencies were worthless clearly hadn't occurred to him. "This isn't over," he said finally, his composure slipping slightly. "Clare, you have 24 hours to come to your senses. If you're not home by tomorrow night, I'll have no choice but to let the Miller family pursue their legal options, and I won't be able to protect your friends here from the consequences." He turned to leave, but Clare's voice stopped him. "Father," she said, standing up slowly, her hand still in Jacob's. "If I come with you now, will you leave Luke and Jacob alone? Will you promise not to use your influence to hurt them?" "Of course," Richard said, though Luke didn't believe him for a second. "This is a family matter. It has nothing to do with them." Clare looked at Luke, and he saw her making the calculation. Her freedom and happiness weighed against their safety. He could see which way the scales were tipping. "Clare, no," he said urgently. "Don't do this. Don't sacrifice yourself to protect us." "I have to," she whispered. "I can't let my problems destroy your life. You and Jacob, you're the best thing that's ever happened to me. I won't let my father hurt you because of me." She knelt down and hugged Jacob tightly, whispering something in his ear that made him start crying. Then she stood and looked at Luke with eyes full of love and regret. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything. For showing me what a real family looks like. For making me believe even for a little while that I could have a normal life." She started toward the door, but Luke caught her arm. "This isn't over," he said quietly, echoing her father's words, but with entirely different meaning. "I meant what I said, Clare. I love you, and I don't give up on people I love." Clare smiled through her tears. "I love you too," she whispered. Both of you. More than I ever thought possible. And then she was gone, walking out into the night with her father and his security detail, leaving Luke and Jacob standing in their doorway, watching the Mercedes disappear into the darkness. Daddy, Jacob said, his small hand slipping into Luke's. Are we going to get Claire back? Luke looked down at his son, at this little boy who'd just shown more courage and moral clarity than most adults ever managed, and felt something solidify in his chest. Yes, buddy, he said firmly. We're going to get her back. Because Jacob was right. Claire was family now, and you didn't abandon family just because bullies made threats. Luke might not have Richard Montgomery's money or political connections, but he had something the billionaire didn't understand. He had people who cared about doing what was right, regardless of the cost. And sometimes, that was enough to move mountains. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, matching Luke's mood as he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He'd barely slept, his mind racing, with plans and possibilities, most of which seemed to end with him and Jacob being crushed by forces beyond their control. But giving up wasn't an option. Not when he'd seen the look in Claire's eyes as she'd been forced to leave. Not when Jacob kept asking when the story lady was coming home. He was interrupted by a knock at the door, not the authoritative pounding of the night before, but a gentle, familiar rhythm. He opened it to find Mrs. Patterson from next door holding a casserole dish and wearing an expression of grim determination. Luke, honey, she said, pushing past him into the kitchen. We need to talk. Mrs. Patterson, if this is about last night. Of course it's about last night, she interrupted, setting the casserole on his counter. Half the neighborhood saw those fancy cars and government plates. And this morning I got a very interesting phone call from my nephew, who works at the state capitol. Luke blinked in surprise. Mrs. Patterson's nephew was a reporter for the state's largest newspaper, someone who'd made a career out of investigating corruption in high places. What did he tell you? Luke asked. That Richard Montgomery is exactly the kind of man who gives capitalism a bad name, Mrs. Patterson said bluntly. That he's been using his money and influence to manipulate political outcomes for years. And that there are a lot of people who would love to see him brought down a peg or two. She pulled out her phone and showed him a news article from that morning's paper. The headline read, Montgomery Industries under investigation for tax evasion and political corruption. It seems, Mrs. Patterson continued with satisfaction, that while Mr. Montgomery was busy tracking down his daughter, some very interesting documents found their way to several news outlets and government agencies. Documents that raise serious questions about his business practices. Luke stared at the article in amazement. How did this happen? Well, Mrs. Patterson said, with a mischievous smile. It turns out that Clare isn't the only member of the Montgomery family who's tired of Richard's controlling ways. Apparently, his late wife left behind quite a collection of papers before she died. Evidence of bribes, illegal campaign contributions, tax avoidance schemes. Claire's been sitting on this information for months, trying to decide what to do with it. And last night after she was forced to leave here, she made her decision. She sent everything to my nephew, along with a detailed statement about her father's business practices and his attempts to force her into an arranged marriage. Luke felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. Mrs. Patterson, if Richard finds out Clare was behind this, he'll have her arrested, kind of hard to do when you're the one under investigation. Mrs. Patterson's smile widened. Besides, Claire's not just sitting around waiting for her father to retaliate. According to my nephew, she's already contacted a team of lawyers, good ones, the kind who specialize in taking down corrupt billionaires. Before Luke could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but when he answered, Claire's voice filled his kitchen. "Luke, thank God. Are you and Jacob okay?" "We're fine," he said quickly. "Are you?" "I'm safe. I'm at a hotel downtown with about 6 lawyers and a security team that's not working for my father." Claire's voice was stronger than it had been the night before, filled with determination instead of defeat. "Luke, I need you to know that I didn't plan this. I never intended to drag you into my family's mess." "Where are you going with this, Claire?" "I'm saying that you were right. About standing up to bullies, about fighting for what matters. I've spent so many years being afraid of my father's power that I forgot I have power too. Information is power, and I have information that could destroy him." Luke felt his heart racing. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to fight," Claire said simply. "I'm going to expose everything, the corruption, the bribes, the way he's manipulated political outcomes for years. I'm going to make sure he can never hurt another family the way he's hurt ours. And David's family. The legal threats." Claire was quiet for a moment. "My lawyers think they're bluffing. Without my father's influence protecting them, the Miller family doesn't have much of a case. And if they do try to pursue charges, we'll countersue for harassment and emotional distress." "Claire," Luke said carefully, "what does this mean for us, for you and me and Jacob?" He heard her take a shaky breath. "I don't know," she admitted. "This is going to be a long fight, Luke. Months of legal proceedings, media attention, death threats from my father's associates. I can't ask you to put Jacob through that." "You're not asking," Luke replied. "I'm offering. We're offering. Jacob's been asking all morning when you're coming home." "Home?" Claire repeated softly, and he could hear the wonder in her voice. "That's what this is," Luke said firmly. "You're home, with us, for as long as you want it. Even if it means reporters camping on your lawn. Even if it means your business suffers because some people will be afraid to hire the contractor who's dating Richard Montgomery's rebel daughter." Luke looked around his kitchen at the place settings Claire had insisted on using for breakfast, at Jacob's artwork still stuck to the refrigerator at the home she'd helped them build in just 1 week. "Claire," he said, "I fell in love with a homeless woman who showed up on my porch in a storm. If I can handle that plot twist, I think I can handle dating a billionaire's daughter who's taking down her corrupt father." Claire laughed, and the sound was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Luke Bennett, you are either the bravest man I've ever met or the craziest." "Maybe both," Luke admitted. "When are you coming home?" "Tonight," Claire said without hesitation. "I have a few more meetings with lawyers and journalists, but tonight I'm coming home. And Luke, when I get there, I want to tell you everything. The whole truth about who I am, what my father did to my mother, why I ran. No more secrets." "I'll be here," Luke promised. "We'll be here." After they hung up, Luke found Jacob in the living room playing half-heartedly with his dinosaurs. His son looked up when he entered, hope and worry warring in his young face. "Was that Claire?" Jacob asked. "Yes, it was. She's coming home tonight." Jacob's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really, she's really coming back." "Really," Luke confirmed. "But Jacob, there's something we need to talk about. Claire's father is a very powerful man who's used to getting his way. He's not going to be happy that she chose us over him. Things might get complicated for a while." Jacob considered this with the seriousness that 5-year-olds brought to important matters. Will there be more mean men? Maybe. And reporters and people asking questions and lots of attention that might not be very comfortable. But Claire will be here, if we want her to be. Jacob nodded decisively. Then I don't care about the mean men or the reporters. Claire makes the best stories and she hugs me like she really means it, and she makes you smile the way you used to before Mommy left." Luke felt his throat tighten with emotion. His 5-year-old son had just summed up what really mattered better than any adult could have. "Okay then," Luke said. "I guess we're all in." That evening, as Luke was making dinner and Jacob was setting the table with extra care, they heard a car in the driveway. But this time, instead of the ominous rumble of Richard Montgomery's Mercedes, it was the cheerful sound of a taxi. Jacob ran to the window and pressed his face against the glass. "She's here, Daddy. She's really here." Luke opened the front door to find Claire standing on his porch once again, but this time she wasn't hiding in the shadows. She stood straight and tall, wearing a simple dress and carrying a single suitcase, and when she smiled at him, it was with the radiance of someone who'd finally stopped running. "I'm home," she said simply. "You're home," Luke agreed, and pulled her into his arms while Jacob bounced around them both, chattering excitedly about all the things he wanted to tell her and all the stories he wanted to hear. Later that night, after Jacob had been tucked into bed with promises of a new adventure story the next day, Luke and Claire sat together on the couch where this had all began. But this time there were no secrets between them, no walls of fear or uncertainty. Just two people who'd found each other in the storm and decided to weather whatever came next together. "So," Luke said, taking her hand, ready to take on the world. Claire smiled and leaned against his shoulder. "With you, I'm ready for anything." Outside, the wind was picking up again, promising another storm. But inside Luke Bennett's modest house in Millbrook, 3 people who'd become a family sat safe and warm, prepared to face whatever tempests might come. Because they'd learned something that all of Richard Montgomery's money and power couldn't buy, that love, real love, was worth fighting for. And sometimes, just sometimes, love was enough to win. The first wave of media attention hit Millbrook 3 days after Claire's return, descending on their quiet town like a swarm of locusts with cameras and microphones. Luke woke to the sound of car doors slamming and voices outside his house, and when he peered through the bedroom curtains, he saw at least a dozen reporters setting up on his front lawn. "Claire," he whispered, shaking her gently awake. "We've got company." She was instantly alert, years of living under scrutiny, having trained her to wake ready for battle. Together, they looked out at the circus that had invaded their peaceful street. News vans lined the curb, reporters spoke into cameras with Luke's house as their backdrop, and photographers with telephoto lenses positioned themselves for the best shots. "I'm sorry," Claire said quietly, her hand finding his. "I knew this would happen, but seeing it—" "Don't apologize," Luke replied firmly. "This is the price of doing what's right. We knew it was coming." Downstairs, Jacob's voice drifted up from the kitchen, chattering excitedly about something he'd seen on his morning cartoon show. The sound of his innocent happiness in the midst of this chaos struck Luke as both heartbreaking and profoundly important. Whatever happened, they had to protect that. "How do we get him to school without putting him through that gauntlet?" Claire asked, gesturing toward the window. Luke was already reaching for his phone. "We don't. Tom Martinez owes me a favor from when I helped rebuild his garage after the tornado. He's got a pickup truck and a lot of opinions about reporters." 20 minutes later, Tom's battered Ford pulled up to Luke's back gate, well away from the media frenzy out front. Tom Martinez was a weathered man in his 60s who'd spent 40 years working construction and had little patience for what he called city folks with too much time on their hands. "Morning, Luke," Tom said gruffly as they loaded Jacob into the truck. "Hell of a thing having these vultures descend on our town." "Thanks for this, Tom," Luke replied, buckling Jacob's seatbelt. "I owe you big time." "You don't owe me nothing," Tom said firmly. What that girl's doing taking on her corrupt father like that takes guts. Besides, Jacob's a good kid. Shouldn't have to run a gauntlet just to get to kindergarten. As they drove away, Luke saw Jacob waving enthusiastically at the reporters through the back window, completely oblivious to why they were there. In his 5-year-old mind, this was just another adventure, another story waiting to be told. Back at the house, Claire stood at the kitchen window, watching the media circus with an expression Luke couldn't quite read. She'd changed since making her decision to fight. There was a steel in her spine now that hadn't been there before, a sense of purpose that transformed her from a woman running from her past into a warrior prepared to face it head-on. "Penny for your thoughts," Luke said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I was thinking about my mother," Claire replied, leaning back against his chest. "She would have loved this, seeing my father finally being held accountable for what he's done. She tried to leave him once, you know. When I was 12, she'd found evidence of some of his illegal activities and threatened to go to the authorities if he didn't change. What happened? He had her committed," Claire said simply. "Told everyone she was having a nervous breakdown, that she was making wild accusations because of her mental state. She spent 3 months in a private psychiatric facility while he destroyed all the evidence she'd collected." Luke felt his arms tighten around her involuntarily. "Jesus, Claire." When she got out, she was different. Broken. She never tried to fight him again, just existed. Like a ghost in her own life. That's when I realized that my father wasn't just controlling, he was dangerous. And that's when I started collecting evidence of my own. "You've been planning this for years." "Waiting for the right moment," Claire corrected. "For a time when I had enough evidence and enough courage. Meeting you and Jacob, it gave me the courage. Seeing what a real family looked like, understanding what I was fighting for, it changed everything." Before Luke could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed the name of his lawyer, Martin Wesley, a straightforward man who'd handled Luke's divorce and various business matters over the years. "Luke," Martin's voice was tense. "We need to talk. Can you come to my office this morning?" "What's wrong?" "I've been contacted by 3 different law firms representing Richard Montgomery. They're making noise about harassment, alienation of affection, and something called intentional interference with family relationships. It's mostly legal posturing, but we need to discuss strategy." Luke looked at Claire, who'd obviously heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. Her face was pale but determined. "We'll be there in an hour," Luke said. Martin Wesley's office occupied the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian house on Millbrook's Main Street. Its old-fashioned charm a stark contrast to the legal battles being waged within its walls. Martin himself was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and the rumpled appearance of someone who cared more about justice than impression. "Claire," he said, rising to shake her hand, "I have to say you've certainly stirred up a hornet's nest. I've been practicing law for 25 years, and I've never seen anything quite like the legal offensive your father has mounted." "What exactly are we dealing with?" Luke asked as they settled into the worn leather chairs facing Martin's desk. "Officially, a series of nuisance lawsuits designed to drain your resources and force Claire back under her father's control," Martin replied, spreading a stack of legal documents across his desk. "Unofficially, a coordinated campaign to destroy your life, your business, and your reputation." Claire leaned forward. "What kind of lawsuits?" "Let's see." Martin consulted his notes. "There's a suit claiming that Luke deliberately alienated you from your family for financial gain. Another claiming that his business is unlicensed and unsafe, which is ridiculous, since I helped him get licensed 5 years ago. There's even one claiming that allowing you to stay in his home constitutes harboring a fugitive." "That's insane," Luke said. "Claire's not a fugitive from anything." "Of course not. But that doesn't mean these suits won't cause problems. Even frivolous lawsuits require time and money to defend against. Your father is clearly hoping to overwhelm you with legal costs until you give up." Claire was quiet for a moment, her hands clenched in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but Luke could hear the anger underneath. "There's something else, isn't there? Something you haven't told us yet." Martin nodded grimly. "This morning, Child Protective Services received an anonymous tip claiming that Jacob is being exposed to dangerous and unstable living conditions. They're required to investigate any report involving child welfare." Luke felt the bottom drop out of his world. "They want to take Jacob. They want to interview him, interview you, inspect the house. It's routine in these situations, but—" Martin paused, choosing his words carefully. "The timing is suspicious, and the person who filed the report had very specific information about your household details that suggest they've been watching you." "When?" Luke asked, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Tomorrow morning. A caseworker named Janet Mills will be here at 10 a.m. Claire stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over Millbrook's main street. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said. "This is why I should have kept running. He's going to destroy you, Luke. He's going to take Jacob away, ruin your business, turn this whole town against you, and it's all because of me." "Claire," Luke said firmly, "look at me." She turned, and he saw the guilt and fear threatening to overwhelm her again. "This is not your fault," he continued. "This is your father's fault. He's the one choosing to use a child as a weapon. He's the one perverting the legal system to intimidate and control. You are not responsible for his choices." "But if you left, he'd win," Luke interrupted. "And Jacob would grow up learning that bullies always get their way if they have enough money. Is that the lesson you want him to learn?" Claire stared at him for a long moment, then returned to her chair. "What do we do?" Martin Wesley smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. "We fight, and we fight smart." He pulled out another folder. "I've been in contact with Claire's legal team in the state capitol. The corruption investigation against your father is moving faster than anyone expected. Several of his business associates have already been arrested, and more indictments are coming." "How does that help us?" Luke asked. "Because it establishes a pattern of vindictive behavior," Martin explained. "When we can show that these lawsuits are retaliation for Claire's cooperation with a federal investigation, they become a lot less credible. And it makes your father's motives very clear to any judge." Claire leaned forward. "What about the CPS investigation?" "We prepare," Martin said simply. "We document everything: your relationship with Jacob, the stability of your home environment, character witnesses from the community. And we make sure that when Janet Mills arrives tomorrow, she finds exactly what she should find: a loving family with a clean, safe home and a happy, well-cared-for child." That evening, Luke's house became a hub of activity as friends and neighbors rallied around them. Mrs. Patterson arrived with a casserole and a stack of character reference letters she'd somehow managed to collect in less than 4 hours. Tom Martinez showed up with his wife Maria to help deep clean the house, even though it was already spotless thanks to Claire's meticulous housekeeping. Dr. Sarah Chen Jacobs' pediatrician stopped by with copies of all his medical records, glowing reports of his health and development. "You know," Dr. Chen said, as she watched Jacob showing Claire his latest Lego creation, "in 15 years of pediatric practice, I've rarely seen a child adjust so well to a major life change. Whatever you two are doing, it's working." Luke felt a swell of pride mixed with terror. What if the caseworker didn't see what Dr. Chen saw? What if Richard Montgomery's influence reached even into Millbrook's social services department? As if reading his thoughts, Claire took his hand. "Jacob is happy and healthy and loved," she said quietly. "That's what matters. That's what any reasonable person will see." And if they're not reasonable, then we appeal, and we fight harder, and we trust that the truth will come out eventually. The next morning arrived with unseasonable warmth and bright sunshine, as if nature itself was offering encouragement. Jacob was excited about staying home from school, chattering about showing the nice lady his dinosaur collection and his rocket ship nightlight. His innocent enthusiasm was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. He had no idea that this visit could change everything. Janet Mills arrived precisely at 10 a.m., a woman in her 40s with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much of humanity's darker side. She introduced herself politely, but with professional distance, making it clear that this was serious business. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "I'd like to start by interviewing you privately, then speak with Jacob, and finally tour the house. Is that acceptable?" "Of course," Luke replied, his mouth dry with nervousness. They sat in the living room while Clare kept Jacob occupied in the kitchen, and Janet Mills opened a thick folder that presumably contained the anonymous report that had triggered this investigation. "Mr. Bennett, how long has Ms. Montgomery been living in your home?" "About 2 weeks," Luke answered honestly. "And what is the nature of your relationship with her?" Luke chose his words carefully. "We're in a romantic relationship. She's also become an important part of Jacob's life." "I see." Janet made notes on her clipboard. "Were you aware when you began this relationship that Ms. Montgomery is estranged from her family due to mental health issues?" Luke felt his temper flare but kept his voice level. "Claire is not estranged due to mental health issues. She left her father's house because he was trying to force her into an arranged marriage and control every aspect of her life." "That's not what the report says," Janet replied mildly. "According to the information I've received, Ms. Montgomery has a history of unstable behavior, including a recent breakdown that resulted in the death of her fiancé." "That's a lie," Luke said firmly. "David Miller died in a car accident that had nothing to do with Claire, and whoever told you she has mental health issues is deliberately misrepresenting the facts." Janet Mills studied him carefully. "Mr. Bennett, are you aware that Ms. Montgomery comes from significant wealth? Have you considered that her interest in you might be financially motivated?" Luke almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "Ma'am, with all due respect, if Claire wanted to use someone for financial gain, I'd be the worst possible choice. I'm a small-town contractor with a mortgage and a 5-year-old son. She's the one with money, not me." "But you're aware of her family's wealth." "Yes, I'm aware of it. I'm also aware that she walked away from all of it because she values her freedom and integrity more than money. That tells me exactly what kind of person she is." Janet made more notes, then looked up at him again. "How has Jacob adjusted to having Ms. Montgomery in the house?" This question Luke could answer with complete confidence. "Better than I could have hoped. Claire is wonderful with him, patient, caring, creative. She helps with his homework, tells him bedtime stories, and treats him like he's the most important person in the world. Jacob adores her. And you don't worry about the instability of the situation, about what happens to Jacob if this relationship doesn't work out." Luke considered the question seriously. "Any relationship involves risk," he said finally. "But Claire isn't just my girlfriend. She's become part of our family. She's not going anywhere." After the private interview, Janet spent nearly an hour with Jacob, and Luke had to resist the urge to hover outside the kitchen door. Instead, he paced the living room while Claire sat calmly reading, projecting a serenity she probably didn't feel. "He'll be fine," she said, without looking up from her book. "Jacob is smart and honest. He'll tell her exactly how he feels about living here." And apparently he did, because when Janet emerged from the kitchen, she looked considerably more relaxed than when she'd arrived. "Jacob is a delightful child," she said, very articulate for his age and clearly very happy. He spoke glowingly about both of you. The house tour went equally well. Janet examined Jacob's room, noting the clean bedding, the organized toys, the educational books on his shelves. She checked the kitchen for adequate food supplies, the bathroom for cleanliness and safety, and even looked at the basement to ensure there were no hazardous conditions. "Mr. Bennett," she said, as they returned to the living room, "I have to ask, have you or Ms. Montgomery ever used illegal drugs or excessive alcohol in front of Jacob?" "Never," Luke replied without hesitation. "We rarely drink at all and never around Jacob." "Has there ever been any domestic violence in this household?" "Absolutely not." "Any concerns about Jacob's behavior, his school performance, his social development?" "None whatsoever. If anything, he's been happier and more confident since Claire came into our lives." Janet Mills closed her folder and looked at all three of them, Luke. Tense but determined, Claire composed but watchful, Jacob playing quietly with his Legos, completely oblivious to the gravity of the situation. "Mr. Bennett," she said finally, "I've been doing this job for 12 years. I've seen children in genuinely dangerous situations, homes where kids aren't safe or loved or properly cared for. This isn't one of those homes." Luke felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. "Jacob is clearly thriving," Janet continued. "He's clean, well-fed, articulate, and happy. He speaks about both of you with obvious affection and trust. The house is clean and safe, you have adequate resources to care for him, and there are no signs of neglect or abuse." "So the investigation is closed?" Claire asked. "I'll file a report stating that the allegations are unfounded and recommending that the case be closed," Janet confirmed. "However, I should warn you that whoever filed the original report may try again. If they do, document everything. Keep records of Jacob's school performance, his medical checkups, anything that demonstrates his well-being." After Janet Mills left, Luke sank onto the couch and pulled both Claire and Jacob into his arms, finally allowing himself to breathe normally for the first time in 24 hours. "So," he said, crisis averted. "One crisis," Claire corrected. "There will be others. My father doesn't give up easily." But as they sat together in their living room, with Jacob chattering about the nice lady who'd asked him so many questions, Luke felt a strange sense of optimism. They'd survived the first major attack. More importantly, they'd proven to themselves and to anyone watching that their little family was strong enough to withstand whatever Richard Montgomery threw at them. The afternoon brought another wave of media attention as news of the CPS investigation leaked to the press. Luke watched from his window as reporters speculated about the outcome, painting him alternatively as a hero standing up to corruption or an opportunist taking advantage of a vulnerable woman. "Vultures," Claire said, joining him at the window. "They don't care about the truth, just the story." "Is this what your life was like before, always being watched, always being judged?" "Worse," Claire admitted. "At least now the attention is about something real, something important. Before it was just about who I was dating or what I was wearing to charity events. Meaningless gossip dressed up as news." That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Luke's phone rang. The caller ID showed Martin Wesley's number, and Luke answered with a mixture of hope and dread. "Luke," Martin's voice was excited. "I just got off the phone with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Richard Montgomery has been indicted on 14 counts of corruption, tax evasion, and bribery. They arrested him an hour ago." Luke looked at Claire, who'd gone very still. "What does that mean for us?" "It means the pressure stops. Now. Montgomery's lawyers will be too busy trying to keep him out of federal prison to worry about nuisance lawsuits. And it means Claire's testimony will be crucial to the prosecution's case." Claire took the phone from Luke. "Martin, what kind of sentence is he looking at?" If convicted on all counts 20 to 30 years, he's 71 years old, Claire. This could be a life sentence. Claire was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but Luke could hear the complex mix of emotions underneath. Good, she said simply. It's time he faced consequences for what he's done. After she hung up, Claire excused herself and went upstairs. Luke found her a few minutes later, sitting on their bed, staring out the window with tears streaming down her face. Hey, he said softly, sitting beside her and pulling her into his arms. Talk to me. I should feel happy, she said. He's finally being held accountable. He can't hurt anyone else the way he hurt my mother, the way he tried to hurt us. So why do I feel so empty? Luke held her closer. Because he's still your father. Because despite everything he's done, part of you probably hoped he'd change, that somehow you could have a real relationship with him. He killed her, Claire whispered. Not directly, but he killed my mother just as surely as if he'd put a gun to her head. He destroyed her spirit, her will to live, her belief that she deserved happiness. And I let him do it, because I was too young and too scared to stop him. You were a child, Claire. It wasn't your responsibility to protect her. But I could have spoken up sooner. I could have released those documents years ago before he hurt so many other people. Luke gently turned her face toward his. You spoke up when you were ready, when you had the strength and support to see it through. And you didn't do it for revenge, you did it to protect other people from being hurt, the way you and your mother were hurt. That takes incredible courage. Claire leaned against him, and he could feel some of the tension leaving her body. What happens now? Now we rebuild, Luke said simply. We make a life together, the three of us. We show Jacob what it looks like when adults choose love over power, when families support each other instead of controlling each other. And the media attention, the legal battles. They'll fade eventually. Reporters will find other stories to chase, and the lawyers will move on to other cases. But we'll still be here, still be us. That night, as they tucked Jacob into bed, he asked a question that surprised them both. Daddy, why was the sad man so mean to Claire? Luke exchanged a glance with Claire, wondering how much their 5-year-old had understood about the week's events. What sad man, buddy? The man who came to our house. The one who wanted to take Claire away. He looked really sad and angry. Claire knelt beside Jacob's bed. Sometimes people do mean things when they're hurting inside, she said gently. That doesn't make it okay, but it helps us understand why they act the way they do. Were you sad when you lived with him? Yes, sweetheart. I was very sad for a very long time. Jacob considered this seriously. But you're happy now. Claire smiled, and Luke saw the last shadows of guilt and fear finally lifting from her face. Yes, Jacob. I'm happier than I've ever been. Good, Jacob said, with the simple satisfaction of childhood. Everybody should be happy. Later, as Luke and Claire sat together on their front porch watching the last of the news vans pack up and leave, Claire took his hand and squeezed it gently. Thank you, she said. For what? For not giving up on me. For not letting me run when things got difficult. For showing me what it means to fight for something you believe in. Luke brought her hand to his lips and kissed it softly. Thank you for staying, for trusting us with your truth, for making our house a home. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, Claire's testimony in her father's trial, the ongoing media attention, the process of building a life together from the ashes of their separate pasts. But tonight, they were simply a family sitting on their front porch, grateful for the unexpected gifts that storms sometimes bring. Clare had arrived in their lives like lightning, sudden, powerful, transformative. And like lightning, she'd illuminated everything around her, showing them possibilities they'd never imagined. In the distance, they could hear the rumble of thunder, promising another storm on the horizon. But Luke no longer feared the sound. He'd learned that storms weren't just about destruction. They were also about renewal, about washing away the old to make room for something new and beautiful. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, they brought exactly what you needed, even if you hadn't known you needed it. 1 year later, Clare stood in the kitchen of the house that had become her sanctuary, her hands dusted with flour as she rolled out dough for Jacob's favorite chocolate chip cookies. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows she'd hung with cheerful yellow curtains, casting warm light across the room where she'd first made breakfast for Luke and his son on that morning that felt like a lifetime ago. So much had changed since that stormy night when she'd hidden on their porch, broken and desperate. The woman who'd trembled in the rain, afraid of her own shadow, felt like a stranger now. In her place stood someone stronger. Someone who'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. The sound of Luke's truck pulling into the driveway made her smile, and moments later she heard his key in the lock, followed by Jacob's excited chatter about his day at school. At 6 years old, now Jacob had grown taller and more confident, but he still rushed to hug her with the same enthusiasm he'd shown that first morning when he declared her the story lady. "Something smells amazing in here," Luke said, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind and pressing a kiss to her neck. His embrace was familiar now, comforting in its certainty, but it still sent warmth spreading through her chest, the way it had from the very beginning. "Mrs. Patterson's secret recipe," Clare replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. She finally decided I'd proven myself worthy of the family secrets. "That woman's been like a mother to half this town," Luke said with affection. "Her approval means more than any certificate or award ever could." It was true. Over the past year, Clare had slowly but surely become part of Millbrook's tight-knit community. It hadn't happened overnight. Small towns were naturally suspicious of outsiders, especially ones who arrived with media circuses and federal investigations in their wake. But patience and genuine care had eventually won over even the most skeptical neighbors. She'd started by volunteering at Jacob's school, helping with reading programs and art projects. Her refined education and natural teaching ability had made her valuable to teachers struggling with overcrowded classrooms and limited resources. When the school's library budget was cut, she'd quietly donated enough money to keep it running, while making it seem like the funds had come from a community fundraiser. The women of Millbrook had been harder to win over than their children, but Clare's willingness to roll up her sleeves and work, helping with church fundraisers, organizing community cleanup days, sitting with elderly neighbors when they were sick, had gradually earned their respect. The fact that she clearly adored Jacob and made Luke happier than anyone had seen him in years didn't hurt either. "How did the testimony go today?" Luke asked quietly, his arms tightening around her slightly. Clare's hands stilled on the cookie dough. Today had been the final day of her father's trial, the culmination of months of legal proceedings that had laid bare the full extent of Richard Montgomery's corruption. Clare had spent 3 days on the witness stand, recounting years of manipulation, control, and abuse, while her father sat just 20 feet away, his cold blue eyes never leaving her face. "It's over," she said simply. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, guilty on all counts. Luke turned her around to face him, searching her expression for signs of the guilt and conflict that had plagued her throughout the trial. "How do you feel?" Clare considered the question seriously. A year ago, she would have been torn apart by conflicting emotions, relief, guilt, sadness, anger, all warring for dominance. Now she felt something simpler and cleaner. "Free," she said finally. "For the first time in my life, I feel completely free." And the sentencing, 25 years, with his health problems and his age. Claire shrugged. "He'll die in prison." She'd expected to feel something more complicated about her father's fate, but she'd learned over the past year that some people were simply too damaged by their own choices to be redeemed. Richard Montgomery had been given multiple opportunities to change, to choose love over control, to build relationships instead of destroying them. Each time, he'd chosen power. "Claire," Jacob's voice interrupted her thoughts as he burst into the kitchen, his backpack trailing behind him. "Guess what happened at school today?" "What happened, sweetheart?" she asked, grateful for the distraction from heavier topics. "Miss Peterson said, 'I'm the best reader in my whole grade,' and Tommy Wilson asked if you could teach his mom how to make those paper cranes like you taught me, and Sarah Jenkins invited me to her birthday party next weekend." Claire smiled, ruffling his dark hair. Jacob's social confidence had blossomed over the past year, helped along by the stability of their home life, and the security of knowing he was loved unconditionally. The nightmares about his mother had stopped months ago, replaced by dreams of adventures and dinosaurs and rocket ships. "That's wonderful news," she said. "And yes, I'd be happy to teach Mrs. Wilson how to make paper cranes. Maybe we can organize a craft afternoon for all the parents who are interested." "Really? That would be so cool." Jacob hugged her tightly around the waist. "You're the best, Claire. I'm so glad you came to live with us." Over Jacob's head, Claire met Luke's eyes and saw the same wonder there that she felt every day, amazement that something so beautiful could have grown from such painful beginnings. After dinner, while Luke helped Jacob with his homework at the kitchen table, Claire stepped out onto the front porch where this journey had begun. The old wooden boards had been replaced over the summer, along with the loose step that Luke had mentioned fixing on that first night. The porch now boasted comfortable chairs and hanging baskets full of flowers that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. She settled into her favorite chair and pulled out her phone to check the messages that had been accumulating throughout the day. Since the trial had ended, she'd been fielding calls from journalists, publishers, and even a few documentary filmmakers interested in telling her story. The idea of sharing her experience publicly still felt overwhelming, but she was beginning to think that maybe her voice could help other people trapped in similar situations. "Penny for your thoughts," Luke said, settling into the chair beside her with 2 cups of coffee. "I was thinking about that interview request from 60 Minutes, Claire said, accepting the coffee gratefully, "and about the publisher who wants me to write a book about corporate corruption and family abuse. What's your gut telling you?" Claire sipped her coffee, considering. "That maybe it's time to stop hiding. Maybe other people need to hear that it's possible to break free from toxic families, that money and power don't have to define your worth. And maybe they need to hear that it's possible to start over, to build something real and lasting, even after your whole world falls apart," Luke added quietly. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the town that had become their haven. In the distance, Claire could see Mrs. Patterson tending her garden, Tom Martinez working on his vintage Mustang in his driveway, the Chen family taking an evening walk with their dog. These small, ordinary moments had become precious to her, proof that life could be simple and good without being empty. "Luke," she said suddenly, "do you ever regret it? Taking me in that night? Everything that came after?" Luke set down his coffee cup and took her hand, his thumb tracing the simple gold band she now wore on her ring finger. He'd proposed 3 months ago, not with fanfare or elaborate gestures, but during a quiet evening much like this one. He'd simply looked at her and said, "Marry me, Claire. Let's make this official." The ring had belonged to his grandmother, a woman who'd understood that the most precious things in life couldn't be bought. "Never," he said firmly. "Not even for a second. You didn't just become part of our family, Claire, you completed it. You made us whole in ways I didn't even know we were broken. Even when the reporters were camping on our lawn, even when your business almost went under because some clients were afraid of the controversy." "Especially then," Luke replied, "because that's when I learned who our real friends were. That's when this community showed its true character. And that's when I realized that you were worth fighting for, worth defending, worth standing beside no matter what came." Claire felt tears prick her eyes. The business had indeed suffered initially, as some clients canceled contracts and new jobs became scarce. But the community had rallied around them in ways that still took her breath away. Neighbors had hired Luke for projects they didn't really need, friends had referred business his way, and Mrs. Patterson had organized an informal boycott of any contractor who refused to work with him. Within 6 months, Bennett Construction was busier than ever. "I have something for you," Luke said, suddenly reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small wrapped package. "It's not my birthday," Claire protested, but she was already smiling. "It's the anniversary of the night you came to us," Luke explained. "I wanted to mark it somehow." Claire unwrapped the package carefully and found inside a delicate silver locket, not expensive or flashy, but clearly chosen with thought and care. When she opened it, she found a tiny photo of the three of them from Jacob's school play the previous month, laughing together in the elementary school auditorium. "Luke," she breathed, "it's perfect." "I thought you should have something to carry with you," he said, helping her fasten the chain around her neck. "A reminder that you have a family who loves you exactly as you are." Before Claire could respond, Jacob appeared in the doorway, wearing his pajamas and carrying his favorite stuffed dinosaur. "Are you guys having mushy time?" he asked, with the frank curiosity of childhood. "The mushiest," Luke confirmed solemnly. "Can I join the mushy time? I like mushy time." Claire laughed and patted her lap. "Of course you can join mushy time. We wouldn't want to exclude the most important member of this family." Jacob settled onto her lap, and Luke's arms came around them both. They sat together as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, three people who'd found each other against impossible odds and chosen to build something lasting. "Claire," Jacob said sleepily, "will you tell me the story about the princess who saved herself?" It had become one of his favorite bedtime stories, Claire's reimagining of classic fairy tales, where the heroines relied on their own courage and intelligence rather than waiting for rescue. Tonight's request felt particularly meaningful. "Once upon a time," Claire began, her voice soft in the gathering darkness, "there was a princess who lived in a tower built of gold and precious stones. Everyone thought she was the luckiest princess in all the land, because she had everything money could buy. But she wasn't happy," Jacob added, knowing the story by heart. "No, she wasn't happy because the tower was also a prison. The king who built it told everyone he was protecting her, but really he was keeping her trapped so she could never leave and live her own life." "And then came the storm," Jacob continued. "And then came the storm," Claire agreed. "The biggest, loudest, most frightening storm the kingdom had ever seen. The princess was so scared that she forgot to be careful, forgot to be quiet. She ran from the tower into the wind and rain with nothing but a small bag and a heart full of hope. And she found the cottage," Jacob said, snuggling deeper into her arms. "She found a cottage where a kind man and his little boy lived. They were just ordinary people who did extraordinary things, like share their food with strangers and offer shelter without asking for anything in return. And they taught her about real love, Jacob finished. They taught her that real love doesn't try to control or possess. Real love makes people stronger, braver, more themselves than they ever thought they could be. And the princess learned that she didn't need to be rescued, she needed to be believed in. And they all lived happily ever after, Jacob said with satisfaction. They all lived happily ever after. Clare confirmed, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. But as she spoke the traditional ending, Clare realized it wasn't quite right. Happily ever after suggested an ending, a final destination where all struggles ceased and all problems were solved. That wasn't what they'd found together. Actually, she corrected gently, they all lived happily ever now, because happiness isn't a destination you reach and then stay at forever. It's a choice you make every day in small moments and big decisions. It's choosing to love even when it's difficult to trust, even when you're scared to believe in tomorrow, even when today is hard. Luke squeezed her shoulder, understanding exactly what she meant. Their love story wasn't about a dramatic rescue or a fairy tale transformation. It was about two broken people choosing to heal together, about creating a family through daily acts of care and commitment, about finding joy in ordinary moments and strength in shared struggles. I like that better, Jacob said drowsily. Happily ever now is more real. After they'd tucked Jacob into bed and read him one more story about brave dinosaurs and distant planets, Luke and Clare returned to their own bedroom. It was a simple room with modest furniture and family photos on the dresser, but it had become a sanctuary for both of them, a place where they could be completely themselves, without fear or pretense. As Clare brushed her hair at the vanity that had been Luke's grandmother's, she caught his reflection in the mirror. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, watching her with an expression of such contentment that it made her heart skip. "What?" she asked, turning to face him. "I was just thinking about that first morning," he said, "when I woke up to the smell of biscuits and found you in my kitchen. I knew then that something had shifted, that life was going to be different, but I never imagined how different." Clare set down her brush and moved to sit beside him on the bed. "Different how? I thought Sarah leaving was the worst thing that could happen to us," Luke said quietly. "I thought it was just destruction, just loss. But if she hadn't left you, never would have found us. Jacob wouldn't have learned what it means to be genuinely cherished by someone who chose to love him. And I wouldn't have discovered that it's possible to love someone so completely that you can't imagine existing without them." Clare took his hands in hers, marveling again at the calluses that spoke of honest work and the gentleness that spoke of a generous heart. "I spent so many years thinking love was supposed to hurt," she said, "that if someone really cared about you, they'd want to control you, to keep you safe by keeping you small. You taught me that real love does the opposite. It helps you become bigger, braver, more yourself than you ever thought possible." They made love that night with the tenderness of people who'd learned not to take such gifts for granted, who understood that every moment of connection was precious and temporary and perfect in its imperfection. Afterward, they lay entwined in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of their house settling around them, and the distant murmur of Jacob talking to his stuffed animals in his sleep. "Luke," Clare said softly, "I want to have a baby." She felt him go still beside her, and for a moment she wondered if she'd spoken too soon, pushed too hard for something he wasn't ready to give. "A baby," he repeated quietly. "I know it's complicated," Clare said quickly. "With the media attention dying down, and my father in prison, this feels like the right time to think about expanding our family. But if you're not ready—" "Clare," Luke interrupted, rolling over to face her in the darkness. "I've been hoping you'd say that for months. I just didn't want to pressure you when you were still dealing with the trial and everything else." Relief flooded through her. "Really? Really? I've watched you with Jacob, seen how natural you are with children, how much love you have to give. The idea of having a baby with you, of watching you become a mother." Luke's voice caught slightly. "It would be the greatest gift imaginable." 6 months later, Claire stood in the same kitchen where this story had begun, one hand resting on her gently rounded belly, while the other stirred pancake batter. Outside, a spring storm was building, and she could hear the rumble of thunder in the distance. But instead of frightening her, the sound made her smile. Storms no longer represented chaos and fear. They represented possibility and change and the promise of new growth. Luke entered the kitchen carrying a sleepy Jacob, who'd crawled into their bed after being awakened by the thunder. At 7 now, Jacob was getting too big to be carried easily, but Luke made the effort anyway, understanding that some comforts should be maintained as long as possible. "Someone wanted to help make breakfast," Luke announced, settling Jacob on his feet near the stove. "Can I crack the eggs?" Jacob asked, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Of course," Claire said, moving aside to give him room at the counter. "But carefully, we don't want shells in our pancakes." As Jacob concentrated on his task with the serious focus he brought to all important matters, Claire and Luke exchanged a look of perfect understanding. This was their life now, small moments of domestic happiness, the comfortable rhythm of family routines, the deep satisfaction of building something lasting together. The baby kicked gently against Claire's ribs, and she placed both hands on her belly, marveling again at the miracle growing inside her. She and Luke had decided not to learn the gender, preferring to be surprised. Jacob had declared that he would be equally happy with a brother or sister, as long as the baby liked dinosaurs and stories about space adventures. "I love you," Luke said quietly, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her expanding waist. "I love you too," Claire replied, leaning back against his chest and watching their son carefully separate egg whites from a small piece of shell. "And I love both of you," Jacob announced without looking up from his task. "And the baby and Mrs. Patterson, and probably the whole world except for Brussels sprouts." They all laughed, and the sound mixed with the rumble of thunder outside and the sizzle of pancakes on the griddle, and the dozens of other small sounds that made up the symphony of their daily life. Later that evening, after Jacob had been read to and tucked in and promised that tomorrow they would build a fort in the living room, Claire and Luke sat together on their front porch, watching the storm pass over Millbrook. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and fresh, and the last of the lightning flickered harmlessly in the distance. "Do you think she would have liked this?" Claire asked suddenly, her hand resting on her belly. "Your grandmother, I mean. Do you think she would have approved of me?" Luke was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. His grandmother had been a formidable woman who'd raised 4 children during the Depression and helped build the community foundation that still supported Millbrook's residents in times of need. "She would have loved you," he said finally. "Not because you're beautiful or educated or come from money, but because you make biscuits from scratch and tell bedtime stories and fight for what's right, even when it's difficult. She would have recognized a kindred spirit." Claire smiled, imagining the strong-willed woman who'd raised the man she loved, who'd worn the ring that now graced Claire's finger. "I wish I could have met her." "In a way you have," Luke replied. "Everything good about this family, everything worth preserving and passing on, it comes from her. Her recipes in our kitchen, her furniture in our house, her values in how we raise Jacob and how we'll raise this baby." As if responding to being mentioned, the baby kicked again, and Claire laughed softly. "I think someone's ready to join this conversation." "Not quite yet," Luke said, placing his hand over hers on her belly. A few more months of growing and getting ready. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge from behind the retreating storm clouds. In the distance, they could see lights coming on in houses throughout Millbrook. Other families settling in for the evening. Other stories of love and loss and resilience playing out behind lit windows. "Claire," Luke said suddenly, "do you ever miss it? The wealth, the luxury, the world you grew up in?" It was a question he'd asked before, usually when something reminded him of the vast difference in their backgrounds. Claire understood his need for reassurance. Sometimes the scope of what she'd given up to be with him must have seemed incomprehensible. "I miss my mother," she said honestly. "I miss having someone who understood that part of my history, who could share memories of better times before my father's control became absolute. But the money, the status, the empty luxury of it all," she shook her head. "I don't miss any of that. Even when you're pregnant and uncomfortable and could afford to hire someone to do all the cooking and cleaning," Claire laughed. "Especially then. Luke, I spent 25 years surrounded by people who were paid to care about my comfort, but who never really knew me as a person. Here Mrs. Patterson brings me ginger tea for morning sickness, because she wants to, not because she's being paid to. The difference is everything. And you don't regret fighting your father, destroying his empire." This question was harder, more complex. The revelation of Richard Montgomery's crimes had indeed brought down his business empire, but it had also cost hundreds of people their jobs, disrupted countless lives, and sent shockwaves through the state's political establishment. "I regret that innocent people were hurt," Claire said carefully. "I regret that it took so long for the truth to come out, that he was able to harm so many people before being stopped. But fighting him, refusing to let him continue using money and power to destroy lives, I don't regret that." Luke squeezed her hand. "The people who worked for him, they're finding other jobs, starting new companies, building better things. Tom Martinez hired 3 former Montgomery Industries engineers for his construction consulting firm. Mrs. Chen's husband started that environmental cleanup company, using the skills he learned working for your father. Sometimes something has to be torn down before something better can be built." It was true. In the year since Richard Montgomery's arrest and conviction, Claire had watched with amazement as former employees and business partners had gone on to create new enterprises based on ethical principles rather than profit at any cost. It was as if removing her father's toxic influence had allowed goodness to flourish in places where it had been suppressed. "I got a letter today," Claire said suddenly, "from David Miller's mother." Luke went still. The Miller family had been vocal critics throughout the trial, insisting that Claire was responsible for their son's death and should face criminal charges. Mrs. Miller in particular had given several painful interviews describing Claire as a heartless manipulator who'd driven her son to his death. What did she say? That she was sorry. That she'd spent months letting grief and anger consume her, looking for someone to blame for David's choices. She said the trial made her realize that her son had been raised to believe he was entitled to any woman he wanted, that love was something you could demand rather than something you had to earn. Claire pulled the letter from her pocket and handed it to Luke. In the porch light, he could see the careful handwriting, the obvious effort that had gone into choosing each word. "She says she's started a foundation," Claire continued as Luke read, "to help young people recognize the signs of emotional manipulation and abusive relationships. She wants to prevent other families from going through what both our families experienced." "That's incredible," Luke said, finishing the letter. "To turn that much pain into something constructive." She asked if I'd consider speaking at their first fundraising event, to share my story to help people understand that abuse doesn't always involve physical violence, that money and status don't protect you from being victimized. What did you tell her? That I'd think about it. That I need to talk it over with my family first. Claire smiled at the word family, still marveling at how naturally it came now. What do you think? Luke considered carefully. I think you have a story that could help people. I think you've learned things about courage and resilience that others need to hear. And I think David's mother is trying to honor her son's memory by preventing the kind of tragedy that took his life. But I also think you don't owe the world anything. You've already paid a huge price for your father's crimes. If you want to focus on our family, on raising our children in peace and privacy, that's your right too. Claire felt the baby move again, a gentle tumbling that reminded her of the new life they were creating together. In a few months, she'd be a mother responsible for protecting and nurturing another innocent soul. The idea of returning to the public eye, of subjecting their family to renewed scrutiny, felt overwhelming. But she also thought about the young women who might be trapped in situations like the one she'd escaped, who might benefit from hearing that it was possible to break free, to build something beautiful from the ashes of a destroyed life. I want to do it, she said finally. Not immediately, not until after the baby's born, and we've had time to adjust to being a family of 4. But yes, I want to use my voice to help people who are facing what I faced. Luke nodded, unsurprised by her decision. Then we'll figure out how to do it safely, how to protect our privacy while still sharing your message. We'll do it together. Together, Claire agreed, loving the sound of the word. As they prepared for bed that night, Claire caught sight of herself in the bedroom mirror and paused. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the terrified girl who'd hidden on this very porch 18 months ago. This woman stood straight and confident, her hand resting protectively on her prominent belly, her eyes bright with hope and purpose. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the years of manipulation and control, the desperate flight into a storm, the kindness of strangers who'd become the most important people in her world. It hadn't been an easy path, but it had been worth every difficult step. What are you thinking about? Luke asked, coming up behind her and meeting her eyes in the mirror. I'm thinking about storms, Claire replied. About how we spend so much time fearing them, trying to avoid them, when sometimes they're exactly what we need to wash away the old and make room for the new. Storms brought you to us, Luke said softly. And storms will come again, Claire added. Different ones, new challenges we can't predict, but we'll weather them together. Together, Luke agreed, and the word was a promise, a vow, a foundation upon which they could build whatever came next. Outside their window, Millbrook slept peacefully under a sky full of stars, the storm having passed and left everything clean and new. In the house on Maple Street, 3 people who'd chosen to become a family settled into dreams of tomorrow, of pancakes and bedtime stories, of garden parties and school plays, of all the ordinary miracles that make up a life well lived. And in a few months, they would welcome a 4th dreamer to their small, perfect kingdom, built on love, instead of money, on choice, instead of obligation, on the radical belief that everyone deserves to be treasured for exactly who they are. Clare Montgomery had lost an empire when she fled her father's house that stormy night. But she'd gained something infinitely more valuable, a home where she was loved, not for her name or her inheritance, but for the woman she'd chosen to become. A family that had been forged not by blood or obligation, but by the daily decision to care for each other through whatever storms might come. It was, she thought, as sleep finally claimed her, the most beautiful ending she could have imagined. And more importantly, it was just the beginning.